So Donald Trump just launched a military invasion of Venezuela, captured its president in the middle of the night, and now says the United States is going to run the entire country while American oil companies extract billions in resources. It's honestly hard to believe we're watching an American president essentially declare he's taking over a sovereign nation. This isn't just about removing a dictator or fighting drug trafficking. We're re-talking about the United States unilaterally deciding to occupy and govern another country in our hemisphere without congressional authorization, without international approval, and without any clear exit strategy. And trust me, the constitutional and legal fallout from this decision is just getting started. Let me fill you in on what's been happening. Donald Trump became president for the second time in January 2025. And from day one, he's been talking tough on Venezuela. He designated drug cartels as terrorist organizations, sent a massive naval armada to the Caribbean, and started bombing boats suspected of drug trafficking in international waters. The administration put a $50 million bounty on Nicolas Maduro's head. They deployed 15,000 troops to the region, positioned the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier off the coast, and sent F-35 jets and nuclear submarines. The escalation has been building for months. Trump repeatedly promised during his campaign that he was done with endless wars and regime change operations. He said he'd bring troops home, not send them into new conflicts. He criticized the Iraq and Afghanistan wars constantly and told his supporters he wouldn't waste American blood and treasure on foreign adventures, whether it was opposing the invasion of Iraq or attacking Biden's handling of Afghanistan. Trump positioned himself as the anti-war candidate who'd focus on America first. But here's where things get wild. On the morning of Saturday, January 3rd, 2026, Trump announced that U.S. Special Forces had conducted a massive military operation in Caracas, the Venezuelan capital, and Delta Force operators, supported by over 150 military aircraft, raided the presidential compound and extracted Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. They were taken to the USS Iwo Jima warship and then flown to New York to face narco-terrorism charges. The operation involved bombing runs, explosions throughout the capital, and what legal experts are calling a full-scale invasion of a sovereign nation. Reports from around January 3rd revealed just how detailed this operation was. Trump stood at Mar-a-Lago with his entire national security team behind him and declared that America would now be in charge of Venezuela. He wasn't talking about a quick extraction mission. He explicitly said the United States is going to run Venezuela, rebuild its oil infrastructure, and control the transition to new leadership, according to multiple sources. Trump told reporters that Vice President Delcy Rodriguez is essentially willing to take orders from the United States, and that American energy companies will invest billions of dollars to fix the oil fields and be reimbursed from Venezuelan oil revenues. Talk about strong words. Essentially, Trump was announcing that the United States just seized control of another country's natural resources and government functions. And this wasn't a private conversation. Trump made sure to broadcast this globally from his press conference, making it crystal clear that he views Venezuela as American property to manage and exploit. This announcement sent shockwaves through Congress because it raised all sorts of questions. If Trump, with all his campaign rhetoric about ending forever wars, could launch an unauthorized invasion and declare America will occupy another country, what did that mean for constitutional checks and balances? Now, this isn't the first time we've seen this pattern with Trump. His relationship with his own campaign promises really only extends as far as political convenience. Whenever those promises conflict with what he wants in the moment, he's quick to abandon them. We've spotted this pattern time and time again. Just think about how he promised to end endless wars, but then bombed Syrian airfields, expanded drone strikes in Yemen, newly started a war with Iran, and kept troops in Iraq and Afghanistan throughout his entire first term. His supporters believed the anti-war rhetoric, but the military actions told a different story. Then there was his promise to drain the swamp and avoid foreign entanglements. Trump criticized nation building constantly, said America wouldn't be the world's policeman, and attacked previous administrations for regime change disasters. But now he's literally announcing that the United States will run Venezuela, rebuild its infrastructure, and manage its transition to new leadership. That's the textbook definition of nation building and regime change. And let's not forget how he handled Iraq during his first term. Trump campaigned on getting out of the Middle East, but then deployed additional troops, increased military spending, and expanded operations. The very thing he criticized Bush and Obama for became his own policy. His base wanted America first, but got America everywhere. Even his promises about congressional consultation have evaporated. Back in November, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles told Vanity Fair that land strikes in Venezuela would require congressional approval. She said explicitly that if Trump authorized land action, that would be war and would need Congress. Administration officials privately told lawmakers the same thing just weeks ago, that they lacked legal justification for land attacks in Venezuela. Senator Chuck Schumer revealed that Trump's team assured him 3 separate times that they weren't pursuing regime change or military action. 3 times they looked lawmakers in the eye and said this wasn't happening. 3 times they lied. There's also his constantly shifting justification for the operation itself. First, it was about drug enforcement and protecting Americans from cartels. Then it became about executing an arrest warrant for an indicted fugitive. Then Trump pivoted to talking about seizing Venezuelan oil and making American companies whole for their nationalized assets. Then he started discussing how Venezuela would have become the United States if he'd lost the election, as if that bizarre comparison justified an invasion. The goalpost moves every single time someone questions what's really happening. And we can't ignore how he's handled his own cabinet's messaging. Secretary Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth spent an entire press conference carefully explaining that this was a law enforcement operation, a surgical strike, a limited action to apprehend 2 criminals. They emphasized the legal precedent, the narrow scope, the law enforcement personnel involved, and then Trump walked out and completely contradicted everything they'd just said by declaring America would run Venezuela, control its oil, delay elections, and manage the transition. He left his own team looking like either fools or liars. Now, it looks like those promises and assurances meant absolutely nothing. This pattern is becoming all too familiar. Trump makes bold declarations about respecting limits and following processes. Defenders cite those statements as evidence of restraint, and then he does exactly what he said he wouldn't do. You can believe every assurance from his administration and trust their public commitments. But the moment political opportunity arises, or he wants something different, those promises get tossed aside without a second thought. So, what did Trump do that triggered this massive operation? Well, it all boils down to Venezuela's oil and Trump's desire to control it, and the situation developed because Trump has been escalating military pressure on Venezuela for months, claiming it's about fighting drug cartels and narcoterrorism. He designated Tren de Aragua as a terrorist organization, invoked the Alien Enemies Act for the first time since World War II, and authorized military strikes against boats in international waters. As commander-in-chief, Trump decided to take an aggressive stance. He positioned a massive military force in the Caribbean, conducted dozens of boat strikes that killed over 115 people, seized oil tankers, and ramped up sanctions. His approach seemed to be overwhelming force combined with maximum pressure to destabilize the Maduro regime. At first, Trump's rhetoric suggested this was about drug enforcement and protecting Americans from cartels. He talked about narco-terrorism, about Maduro being a criminal, about drugs flooding into the United States. The Justice Department had indicted Maduro back in 2020 on narco-terrorism charges, so there was a legal pretext for an arrest. But here's where things started to go wrong. As the military buildup continued into December and early January, the stated justifications began shifting. Trump started talking more openly about Venezuela's oil reserves, the largest proven reserves in the world. He mentioned how American companies had been nationalized by the socialist regime and deserved to get their assets back. The focus drifted from drug enforcement to resource extraction and geopolitical control. This was the moment Trump's real intentions became clear. Secretary of State Marco Rubio initially tried to frame this as a law enforcement operation, a surgical strike to apprehend 2 indicted fugitives. He emphasized that this was about executing an arrest warrant, that law enforcement personnel were part of the extraction team, that this was supported by precedent from the Manuel Noriega case in Panama. But then, when Trump held his press conference at Mar-a-Lago, he absolutely blew up that careful narrative. In Trump's framing, this wasn't just about arresting Maduro, this was about taking control of Venezuela's oil, rebuilding the infrastructure, running the country's government, and using Venezuelan resources to reimburse American companies. He said explicitly that the United States would run Venezuela until a proper transition occurred, that American energy companies would invest billions, that we'd extract the oil to pay for everything. Now, this puts everyone in an impossible position. On one side, Trump's own Secretary of State and military leaders really need to maintain the legal fiction that this was a law enforcement operation with limited scope. That's the only plausible legal justification under existing precedent. The 1989 Barr memo that authorized the FBI to make extraterritorial arrests as their foundation. On the flip side, Trump actually has to explain to the American people and the world what he's really doing, which is seizing control of another country's government and resources. That means admitting this goes way beyond a law, enforcement action, and acknowledging that the United States just launched an invasion and occupation. The tricky part is that these two positions are fundamentally incompatible. You cannot say this was a law enforcement operation to execute an arrest warrant and then turn around and say we're now going to run the entire country, control its oil production, delay elections, and manage its transition to new leadership. Those are contradictory legal theories that undermine each other. So Trump's team is caught in a bind. They can either stick with the narrow law enforcement justification, which means they need to extract U.S. forces immediately after capturing Maduro and not establish any kind of governing presence, but that abandons Trump's stated goals of controlling Venezuelan oil and running the country, or they can embrace the broader regime change and nation building mission that Trump described, which means acknowledging this was an act of war requiring congressional authorization, but that opens them up to devastating legal challenges and constitutional violations. It's a complete mess, and that's exactly what Trump creates for everyone around him. He demands that his team provide legal cover and political justification, but then he personally undermines those efforts by saying the quiet part loud, by admitting what he's really doing, and by making claims that contradict the official story. This whole scenario is causing massive fractures in Washington. Congress is absolutely divided over what just happened and whether Trump had any legal authority to do it, if Trump has launched an unauthorized war and is willing to publicly declare that America will occupy another country. Every member of Congress is left wondering where and the limits are. Those moderate Republicans who believe in constitutional restraint and congressional war powers are now extremely uncomfortable. Senators like Mike Lee initially questioned the operation, but then changed his tune after a phone call with Rubio. The pressure to fall in line with Trump is intense, but the constitutional violations are so blatant that even supporters are struggling to defend this. Meanwhile, the Democrats and some anti-war Republicans believe Trump has completely overstepped his authority and violated the separation of powers. They're pointing out that the War Powers Resolution requires congressional notification, that Article I gives Congress the power to declare war, and that the president cannot unilaterally invade and to go occupy another country just because he wants to. Things became even more intense when Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and other Democratic leaders issued scathing statements. Schumer said that launching military action without congressional authorization and without a credible plan is reckless. He revealed that the administration had assured him 3 separate times that they were not pursuing regime change or military action in Venezuela. He accused Trump of deliberately misleading Congress and the American people about his intentions. Senator Tim Kaine announced that his bipartisan war powers resolution would come up for a vote in the Senate next week. The resolution stipulates that the United States should not be at war with Venezuela absent to clear congressional authorization. Kaine called Trump's action an unauthorized military attack and a sickening return to when America asserted the right to dominate the internal affairs of all nations in the Western Hemisphere. He warned that this history is replete with failures and that Trump risks plunging the hemisphere into chaos. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said Trump has a constitutional responsibility to follow the law and protect democratic norms. He pointed out that far too many questions remain unanswered, including whether American troops are on the ground in Venezuela and what Trump's plan actually entails for running another country. When someone as prominent as the Senate Minority Leader publicly accuses the president of lying about military operations, and when bipartisan resolutions are being introduced to block the action, we're in a world of constitutional crisis. Legal scholars are noting that we haven't seen this kind of unilateral presidential action without any international or congressional support since the most controversial moments of the Iraq War. Jimmy Guruli, a Notre Dame law school professor and former assistant U.S. attorney, went on multiple news outlets and stated bluntly that this is clearly a blatant, illegal, and criminal act. Just think about that for a moment. A respected legal expert who served in the Justice Department is calling the president's military operation illegal and criminal. And this is coming from someone with deep expertise in international law and executive power. Mark Nevitt, a former Navy attorney who now teaches at Emory University School of Law, mentioned that he sees no legal basis for the United States to go into another country and take its leader without an extradition treaty. When legal experts from across the political spectrum start using terms like illegal, criminal, and unauthorized, that's the moment to really pay attention. Jeremy Paul, a professor at Northeastern University specializing in constitutional law, pointed out the fatal flaw in the administration's argument. He said you cannot claim this was a law enforcement operation and then turn around and say, now we need to run the country. It just doesn't make any sense. That contradiction is at the heart of why this operation is constitutionally indefensible. So let's break down what this could mean because it's not just a captivating legal and political story. It has serious consequences for how our government operates and what limits exist on presidential power. First up is the immediate political fallout. Trump is facing significant backlash from Democrats and even some Republicans over launching military action without congressional authorization. The House already voted on and narrowly defeated two separate resolutions that would have forced Trump to remove troops from Venezuela-related operations. The margins were razor thin, 213 to 211 and 216 to 210, which shows how divided Congress actually is on this issue. And honestly, that's a terrible look for Trump politically. Most Americans have serious concerns about getting involved in another Middle East style occupation, and South America is even more sensitive because of our history of intervention in the region. People remember Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the promises about weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be false. They remember the costs in blood and treasure, the instability we created, and the lack of any clear success. Democrats are definitely planning to make this a central campaign issue. They'll argue that Trump lied about ending forever wars, that he violated the Constitution by acting without congressional approval, that he's putting American troops at risk for oil company profits, and that he has no credible plan for what happens next in Venezuela. You can expect to see footage of Trump's operation, congressional testimony from legal experts, and comparisons to past military disasters in campaign ads, speeches, and debates nonstop. Now let's touch on what this means for constitutional checks and balances. The framers of the Constitution gave Congress the power to declare war, specifically to prevent presidents from unilaterally launching military adventures. That's why Article I places war powers in the legislative branch. The idea was that decisions to send Americans into combat should require broad consensus and democratic deliberation, not just one person's judgment. But by launching this Venezuela operation without congressional authorization, Trump has essentially asserted that the president can invade any country, seize its leader, and occupy its territory based solely on executive discretion. If he gets away with that, it fundamentally changes the balance of power between the branches. Congress becomes irrelevant to questions of war and peace. The president can do whatever he wants militarily, and the only check is whether Congress has the political will to cut off funding, which is extremely difficult once troops are already deployed. This situation shines a massive spotlight on whether we still have a functioning system of checks and balances or whether we've devolved into an imperial presidency with virtually unlimited war powers. At the heart of the issue is whether Trump can just invade another country whenever he feels like it and then declare that America will govern that territory. If he can do this in Venezuela, what's to stop him from doing it in Cuba, Nicaragua, or anywhere else he decides poses a threat to American interests? The founders designed our system specifically to prevent this kind of unilateral executive action. They had lived under monarchy and knew the dangers of concentrating war powers in one person. They created a system where Congress would declare war, fund military operations, and provide oversight, while the president would act as commander-in-chief during authorized conflicts. That separation was meant to ensure that major military commitments had democratic legitimacy and power weren't just the whim of whoever happened to occupy the White House. But Trump has always been uncomfortable with those constitutional limitations. He craves total control over foreign policy and views congressional constraints as obstacles to overcome rather than legitimate exercises of constitutional authority. If he succeeds in establishing that the president can launch invasions and occupations without congressional approval, that's a massive expansion of executive power, and it opens the door for future presidents to abuse that authority even further. So the implications of this case reach far beyond Venezuela and Trump's second term. It's about whether we're setting a precedent that will govern presidential war powers for decades to come. Each time a president brushes aside constitutional requirements, ignores congressional authority, or attacks the separation of powers, it weakens our democratic institutions. It starts making behavior that used to be completely unacceptable feel normal. Think about it. If Trump can invade Venezuela and declare that America will run the country, what's to stop the next president from doing the same somewhere else if he can bypass Congress on matters of war and peace? What's to prevent another president from ignoring legislative branch war powers entirely? These actions don't just disappear when Trump leaves office, they become precedent. They become part of how future presidents understand their authority. And that's extremely dangerous for democracy. The American system relies on those constitutional norms and checks and balances, assuming that people in power will respect limits even when it's inconvenient. When those norms crumble and constitutional requirements become optional, democracy itself starts to erode. Looking ahead, it's clear that all of this is going to have some significant electoral effects. We're in early 2026, with midterm elections approaching later this year and the next presidential election in 2028. The narrative being set now will influence how voters think about Trump's leadership and the Republican Party's direction. If the story becomes one of Trump launching unauthorized wars, ignoring the Constitution, getting American troops bogged down in South American nation building, and having no clear exit strategy, while oil companies profit, that spells serious trouble for Republicans. Voters generally don't reward chaos and constitutional crises. They want stability, competence, and respect for democratic norms. The polling data is already concerning for Republicans. According to recent surveys, most Americans oppose military intervention in Venezuela without congressional approval. Independent voters, in particular, express skepticism about getting involved in another regime change operation. Domestic issues like inflation and healthcare remain pressing concerns. Trump's S-base might support aggressive foreign policy, but swing voters who decide elections tend to be more cautious about military adventures. Moreover, Trump's explicit acknowledgement that this is about oil plays directly into Democratic narratives about him prioritizing corporate interests over American lives. When he says American energy companies will invest billions and be reimbursed from Venezuelan oil, he's essentially admitting that this operation benefits Chevron and ExxonMobil more than average Americans. That's political dynamite in states where working class voters already feel like Washington serves the wealthy and connected. The contrast with his campaign promises couldn't be starker. Trump ran on ending forever wars and bringing troops home. Now he's committing American forces to running another country indefinitely. He promised America first. Now he's announcing America will rebuild Venezuela's infrastructure at massive cost. He attacked Biden for chaotic foreign policy. Now he's creating the biggest constitutional crisis over war powers in decades. Right now, Trump isn't offering any of those things voters wanted. He's offering unilateral military action, contradictory legal justifications, open admission that this is about seizing another country's oil, and a plan to occupy Venezuela indefinitely. That's not a message that plays well with swing voters or even with many traditional conservatives who believe in limited government and constitutional restraint. So expect Democrats to champion a message focused on restoring constitutional government and ending reckless military adventures. After watching Trump violate separation of powers and launch an unauthorized war of choice in Venezuela, there are plenty of voters who will be receptive to arguments that we need leaders who respect the Constitution and won't drag America into endless occupations. They're promising no more constitutional crises, no more presidents acting like monarchs who can do whatever they want, just a return to normal governance where Congress has its proper role and the rule of law actually means something. That message might resonate strongly with voters, including some Republicans, who are uncomfortable with Trump's authoritarian tendencies and his contempt for constitutional limits. The Venezuela operation could become the defining issue that shapes how people view Trump's second term and whether they want to continue down this path of unchecked executive power. So here's the deal. Donald Trump just invaded a sovereign nation, captured its president, and announced that America will now run Venezuela and extract its oil wealth for American companies. This isn't just about removing a dictator or fighting drug cartels. It's about whether an American president can take unilaterally, launch wars, occupy other countries, and seize their resources without congressional authorization, without international support, and without any regard for constitutional limits. If Trump succeeds in establishing this precedent, then we're basically saying that the separation of powers doesn't matter anymore, that Congress has no real authority over questions of war and peace, that the president can act like an emperor whenever he wants. That would mean we're stepping into a completely new system where constitutional checks and balances are just suggestions that the president can ignore if they're inconvenient. It's about so much more than just Venezuela. It's about whether we genuinely have a constitutional republic with meaningful limits on executive power, or whether we're transitioning to a system where the president has virtually unlimited authority to use military force anywhere in the world for any reason he deems sufficient. So keep an eye on this. The Senate is voting on a war powers resolution next week. Congressional hearings are coming, legal challenges are being prepared, international reactions are still developing. This ride is far from over. The stakes have never been higher, the constitutional violations clearer, and the outcome more unpredictable. We're watching in real time as fundamental questions about American democracy get tested. What happens next will determine whether the United States remains a constitutional republic or whether we've entered an era of unchecked presidential power that would have terrified the founders